Billions to Trillions to Action, Mobilizing Finance for Development 2016 to 2030. Financing Development in Colombia, with Andres Escobar Arango.
The National Development Plan is an interesting institutional feature that Colombia has. Each government has to present to Congress a development plan for the next 4 years. It has to be approved within the first 9 months of the presidential term. So it has already been approved in Colombia at the end of May. And SDGs, you can find them across the board within the plan. So green growth is there, infrastructure construction is there, resilience to climate change is included in the plan. And the important thing is, because it's a law, it is very powerful, and you can do some important changes and remove red tape and create additional resources, etc. So the development plan is a very powerful tool, and in this case for SDGs, it's going to be very important. Colombia does not enjoy the benefit of official development assistance anymore, and it makes sense. That kind of assistance is more needed in other countries. So we are left on our own to finance our own development. So we have to come up with new strategies that pull together resources from domestic, private sector, from the international capital market, from multilateral loans, etc. But we can get financing from a lot of sources, but at the end, it's our own resources which will pay for the strategy. So we have to be very aware of our limitations. We are on our own, so every dollar or every peso counts. One important aspect we've been working very hard on is the construction of infrastructure. Infrastructure is very important for Colombia because we are very much lagging behind in terms of the quality of our infrastructure and the capacity of infrastructure to link faraway producers in the agricultural sector to the mainstream country and to export markets. So that's one very important financing need that we have. And also the eradication of poverty and universalization of education coverage. We've also identified important resources that have to be put in there because kids go in different shifts to school in Colombia in a large number of parts in the country. And we want kids to go only in one single shift to school, which improves quality substantially. And at the current rate at which we are building new schools in order to create the single shift, it would take Colombia 60 years to put all the kids into the single shift. With the investments we're going to make based on the development plan, we're going to do the investments in 5 years. We're starting to shift the allocation of resources for spending within the public budget based on performance of each sector. Of course, each sector of the budget has to receive some allocation, but the ones that perform the better might get some additional rewards. We are working a lot on evaluating programs and making assessments of whether the programs are having the desired impacts. So the kinds of limitations that our new situation creates is forcing us to behave in a much more responsible way, which should be the case for everyone. For that, of course, we need, for the construction of infrastructure, we need private participation. There's no way the Colombian budget will be able to finance the most ambitious, historically speaking, infrastructure building program that we have had ever in Colombia. So we have to make sure that a domestic financial system comes in, external financing comes in, and of course the budget will put a lot of money into it too, but for a lot of programs we will need to mobilize serious resources from a number of sources. The infrastructure story is very ambitious, and we've created a series of vehicles actually to be able to put together public and private money that will go into the financing of these projects. First of all, we approved in Congress a new PPP law that makes it easier for the private sector to come in. We allowed banks to leverage out more every dollar that they put into credits going to infrastructure. We created a new development bank. It's called Financiera de Desarrollo Nacional. We decided to bring in good partners to put equity into the bank. So we have the IFC as a partner. We also have CAF, which is a regional development bank in South America. And we also brought the Sumitomo Mitsui Bank of Japan as a partner. So all the investment decisions and the lending decisions that this bank is going to make are going to be using the most strict corporate governance criteria out there, which we think is very important. We also changed legislation to allow private pension funds to invest in infrastructure, which is very important. We lowered withholding taxes for external credits coming to finance these projects, so we reduced it enough so that foreign banks are interested in making part of this enterprise. And finally, we created a fund called FONDES, el Fondo de Desarrollo Nacional. Proceeds from privatizations will be put by the government into this fund. This fund will complement all the financing strategy, providing guarantees, credit enhancements, subordinated loans. And in that way, we're going to bring together all the pieces of the puzzle. The first projects of the infrastructure 4G program, we call it 4G, have already been awarded. And the financial closing of the first projects will have to be submitted to the government in a couple of months. So we should start seeing the initial building of this new infrastructure program before the end of this year. And during the next 4 or 5 years, it will be very important in terms of GDP. It will help, of course, Colombia to manage this drop in oil prices and will give a counter-cyclical component to the construction sector, which is going to be very important. All of this had to take place in a very orderly manner, and multilateral institutions have helped us a lot in bringing all these pieces of the puzzle together, and we think they're now in place, and we're just waiting for the building to start, and we should have a completely new infrastructure in a couple of years. In terms of mobilizing domestic resources for infrastructure building, for example, I already mentioned that banks will be able to leverage out more of their equity if the credits go into the infrastructure sector. We're working very closely with the financial sector in order to make them more aware of the importance of lending to sustainable projects. Some private banks in Colombia are already putting additional, let's say, bonus points if the project has some sustainability consideration built into it, or they, in some sectors of the economy, they have decided not to lend if the project doesn't have a sustainable component built into it. So that's very important. Also, the ability to generate new power with new sources, for example, like geothermal or wind power, etc. The private sector is very interested in financing those projects. They perceive the possibility of these projects as very good, and actually we don't see the need to put any fiscal incentives to those kinds of projects so far, and the private sector is willing to, as I said, to finance those kinds of projects. Colombia has a dual pension system. We have a pay-as-you-go system run by the state, but we also have private pension funds that already have close to 20% of GDP of assets under management. So they have a substantial portion of the country's savings. And when you think about the kinds of investments that would be attractive to the people that are contributing to these pension funds, it turns out that infrastructure is one of them. It's long maturities, relatively profitable, and actually, if you look at the experiences of other countries in Latin America, you see that pension fund money has played an important role in financing infrastructure. So what we did was to create a special, let's say, a bucket in the portfolio of potential investments that pension funds can send the money to, and we decided to create one specific for infrastructure. We still have to make an additional change, which we think is important, because subnational governments save in a special fund in Colombia called FONPET, the Territorial Pension Fund. And that fund, as of today, cannot invest in infrastructure. But if private pension money can go to infrastructure, why cannot territorial pension fund money go to infrastructure too? So we're going to make some changes to regulation to make sure that a conservative portion, maybe less than 7 or 5% of the money saved for pensions, can go into infrastructure, which is a very important complement to the overall strategy of financing those projects. Well, Colombia suffered a very serious financial crisis at the end of the 1990s. As a result of that crisis, Colombia completely changed the financial system regulation, very successfully so. To give you an example, when the international financial crisis kicked in 2008 and 9, the Colombian financial sector withstood the shock very well. We have a very strong banking system. The rest of the capital markets are starting to grow, but in Colombia they're relatively small compared with the banking sector. So one thing that we are working on, which we think is going to be very important in terms of expanding the capacity of the rest of the capital market to mobilize resources, is that we're making an alliance with Mexico, Chile, and Peru, and the 4 countries have gone into what we call the Pacific Alliance. And we're working hard on integrating the capital markets of the 4 countries and allow, for example, pension funds to be able to invest in securities issued by the other countries. We're working on pulling together money for an infrastructure fund. We are allowing people that issue stock in Colombia, for example, that it can be purchased by investors in other countries. So critical mass is very important. And you have in Latin America, Brazil, which is a very huge capital market. And bringing together these 4 capital markets in these 4 countries is going to become a second very important player, which will be able to mobilize resources for each of the 4 countries. And we think that for Colombia, this is the way to go because size has its limits, and if we pull together other efforts, we can build a much bigger one. Foreign investors are wondering whether we're gonna come through in terms of fiscal responsibility. And we have a fiscal rule which gives us some room to accommodate to this new oil scenario. But it's also very demanding in terms of cutting down its spending and eventually creating additional taxes to compensate for the oil revenues that used to accrue to the government. So the business community is expecting whether fiscal discipline will remain in place and what types of taxes will be levied in the future, which of course both considerations are crucial in terms of business confidence. And the policy decisions we've made so far are that we're going to fully commit to complying with the fiscal rule. This is very important in order to maintain the financing flows coming from abroad to the government. Whatever changes we make to the tax code will not increase the burden on corporate taxes because we're very mindful of the importance of business confidence being there. And we're starting to work with the oil and mining sector, which has been very hard hit by this downturn in prices, to see what we can do on the part of the government to keep the interest of these companies to continue investing in Colombia. All this is very important because Colombia's good times happen when 2 things happen. When terms of trade are good, means when the exchange rate is depreciated and the price of our exports is good relative to the price of our imports, and when we get capital inflows. Bad times happen when the opposite happens. So it's very important to keep fiscal discipline in place in order to build on the business climate and making sure that investors are willing to continue coming to Colombia to finance our development agenda.